be in 2 Peter. 2 Peter, really grateful for Phil leading that song. It's the perfect song because we're going to talk about the King of Glory and the fact that the King of Glory is coming. In 2 Peter 3, we learned what some of these false teachers are saying. And in 2 Peter 3, verses 3 and 4, Peter says, "Know this first of all, that in the last days mockers will come with their mocking, following after their own lusts, and saying, 'Where is the promise of his coming?' For ever since the fathers fell asleep, all continues just as it was from the beginning of creation." Tragically, some of the Christians that Peter is writing to believed that Jesus was not coming back. They looked out at the earth and they said, seems like for thousands of years, things haven't really changed. Seems like things are just kind of the same. And so maybe God doesn't really care that much about dealing with evil, and he's kind of indifferent, and he's probably never going to come back. This false view then emboldened people to sin. And so one of Peter's main goals in this letter is to instruct them in the true knowledge of God, that Jesus is indeed coming back in power and in glory to bring destruction and judgment on the wicked, but also blessings on the righteous. And we'll talk more about that in Bible class this morning, but this reminded me of what Paul said. If you turn to 1 Corinthians 11, in 1 Corinthians 11, it reminds me of something Paul said about the Lord's Supper there. In 1 Corinthians 11, in verse 26. He says there, 1 Corinthians 11, 26, "As often as you eat this bread and drink the cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until He comes." What he's saying is an anticipation and an eager longing, like Phil talked about, is a fundamental part of partaking the Lord's Supper. We partake in anticipation of the day that the King of Glory will come back. The word coming is the word parousia in Greek, and it means presence. In Jesus' case, it signals the arrival of a king to bring salvation to his people and judgment on his enemies. And the Old Testament foretold of God's Messiah being crowned king, clothed in glory, bringing down judgment on the wicked. And I want us this morning to look at some of those passages and then just make a couple points to think about before the Lord's Supper. Let's look in Psalm chapter 2. We're going to be in the Psalms this morning. Psalm 2. This psalm is about God installing His Son as king, despite the rebellion of the rulers of this world trying to stop it from happening. And so verses 1 through 3, Psalm 2, says this: "Why are the nations in an uproar, and the peoples devising a vain thing? The kings of the earth take their stand, and the rulers together take counsel together against the Lord and against His anointed, saying, 'Let us tear their fetters apart and cast away their cords from us.'" So the rulers of this world, who, by the way, are influenced by the spiritual rulers in the heavenly places, well, they don't want God's king reigning over them. They want to be the kings of their own life. They want to do what they want to do, so they plot together against God's anointed king to keep him from reigning over them. But did you notice the problem with all of their plotting? Well, verse 1 says, it's all in vain. It's a vain thing. Some of you all may know Dee and Renee Anderson from Florida College. Well, Renee Anderson is a man well known for his wrestling matches with the college boys. And I myself wrestled Renee many times at FC. And Renee is a very short man, and he was way older than me. All of his hair was gray, and so I thought this was going to be a piece of cake. But I was stunned by this man's strength. And he would somehow manage to get around behind me every time and get my back, get me wrapped up in some way. And I was just so frustrated because I just thought, there's no way this guy should be beating me. And I was too prideful to tap out. And so what I did was I would just sit there scheming and plotting, like, okay, what can I do to get my arm under his and, try to shift my weight and get him off me. And all my plotting was just in vain because he would just not budge. I couldn't do a thing but tap out. And to make the humiliation worse, every time I would try something and try some crafty, clever move, he would end up just making fun of me and saying, "What's the matter? You know, is that the best you can do?" And maybe call me a girl's name or something like that. And it was very, very humiliating. And then he would just sink a chokehold in and finish me off. So that's what it was like in Psalm 2. With these evil nations, plotting and scheming to keep God's king from ruling over them, from keeping them under his reign. And yet, notice verses 4 through 6. He who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord scoffs at them. And then he will speak to them in his anger and terrify them in his fury, saying, "But as for me, I have installed my king upon Zion, my holy mountain." So God, he's laughing at these nations like Renee was laughing at me. He's saying, "What's the matter? Is that the best you've got?" And then he sinks the chokehold in and he finishes them off. But of course, this passage is not talking about a friendly wrestling match. These are legitimate enemies of God who are sinning and rebelling against the creator of the universe, even trying to murder his son. And so God says, enough. Now it is time to quake in fear because my king has been installed. He has come to reign on Zion. Mount Zion was the hill upon which Jerusalem and the temple were built. And so in the metaphorical language of the prophets, it came to mean the beautiful dwelling place of God and his people. If you continue verses 7 through 9, he says, "I will surely tell of the decree of the Lord. He said to me, 'You are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will surely give the nations as your inheritance, and the very ends of the earth as your possession. You shall break them with a rod of iron and shatter them like earthenware.'" In ancient thought, kings were viewed as the sons of the gods, reigning on their behalf. So when God in verse 7 declares him son and says, "Today I have begotten you," he doesn't mean that this son was literally just born and now he's putting a baby on the throne. No, it means today you have become king. You have officially become my son in the sense of reigning on my behalf. And notice the utter domination that this son has. His territory is not limited to one city or one country or even one continent. He owns every single part of the earth. Absolutely everything and everyone belongs to him and is under his rule and authority. And anyone who tries to stand in his way will be broken and shattered to pieces. And so he says in verses 10 through 12, "Now therefore, O king, show discernment. Take warning, O judges of the earth. Worship the Lord with reverence and rejoice with trembling. Do homage to the Son, that he not become angry and you perish in the way. For his wrath may soon be kindled. And how blessed are all who take refuge in him." Notice here that Jesus' coming in judgment is both terrifying and comforting. For all of those wicked nations who fight against and rebel against Jesus' rule, his coming is terrifying. But for those who worship the Lord in reverence, we can rejoice because we'll be blessed by God for taking refuge in his glorious King. Now, let's look at some more Psalms. We're not going to read the whole Psalm like we did with this one, but I want us to notice how common this theme is, just in a few Psalms, about God's King coming in glory to judge his enemies. Look in Psalm 24. Psalm 24. This psalm is about God coming, and when he comes, he's going to meet his people on Mount Zion. And so look in verse 3 and 4. He asks this question first. Psalm 24, verse 3. "Who may ascend into the hill of the Lord? And who may stand in his holy place? He who has clean hands and a pure heart, who has not lifted up his soul to falsehood and has not sworn deceitfully." So first he kind of sets the scene by saying the way to make sure that we are prepared for the coming of the King is to have pure hands and pure hearts. And once we've been purified, now we'll be ready for the King of Glory to come to His holy hill, to come to His holy mountain and arrive on the scene. And so drop down to verse 7. It says, "Lift up your heads, O gates, and be lifted up, O ancient doors, that the King of Glory may come in." Who is the King of Glory? The Lord strong and mighty, the Lord mighty in battle. Lift up your heads, O gates, and lift them up, O ancient doors, that the King of Glory may come in. Who is the King of Glory? The Lord of hosts. He is the King of Glory. So here, it's God the Father pictured as the King of Glory coming to be with His people. But notice when He comes, it says He's mighty in battle. And He's called the Lord of hosts, which is a reference to His spiritual army. Because when God comes, He's not coming alone. He's coming with His host, His spiritual army, to dole out retribution on His enemies. Psalm 72. Look in Psalm 72. This is a psalm asking God that He would bless the king, so that the king would rule in righteousness, and that his reign would be forever, and that He'd be compassionate to the afflicted, and that He'd bring blessings to the whole earth. So Psalm 72, verses 8 through 11, it says this, "May He also rule from sea to sea, and from the river to the ends of the earth. Let the nomads of the desert bow before Him, and His enemies lick the dust. Let the kings of Tarshish and of the islands bring presents. The kings of Sheba and Seba offer gifts, and let all kings bow down before Him, and all nations serve Him." Drop down to verse 17 now, 17 to 19. "May His name endure forever. May His name increase as long as the sun shines. And let men bless themselves by Him. Let all nations call Him blessed. Blessed be the Lord God, the God of Israel, who alone works wonders. And blessed be His glorious name forever. And may the whole earth be filled with His glory. Amen and amen." This psalm paints the picture of God's ideal king. He reigns forever without end. He crushes His enemies. He blesses His people. He fills the whole earth with His glory and His majesty. Let's look at one more. Psalm 96. Psalm 96. And by the way, there's a reason we're looking at all these in addition to the Lord's Supper talk, is that this is going to connect perfectly with our Bible class this morning. So I'm purposely going to all these passages to set that up. But look in Psalm 96, verse 7, down to the end of the chapter. "Ascribe," verse 7, "to the Lord, O families of the peoples, ascribe to the Lord glory and strength. Ascribe to the Lord the glory of His name. Bring an offering and come into His courts. Worship the Lord in holy attire. Tremble before Him, all the earth. Say among the nations, the Lord reigns. Indeed, the world is firmly established. It will not be moved. He will judge the peoples with equity. Let the heavens be glad, and let the earth rejoice. Let the sea roar, and all it contains. Let the field exult, and all that is in it. Then all the trees of the forest will sing for joy before the Lord, for He is coming. For He is coming to judge the earth. He will judge the world in righteousness and the peoples in His faithfulness." The whole earth here is rejoicing at the thought of God coming, this King of Glory coming to bring down judgment on the wicked and to remove the evil from His sight. It's a little reminiscent of what Paul says in Romans chapter 8 about all of creation longing for the revealing of God's glory and the revealing of our glory with Him when He returns. And you know, the truth is, we could keep going with more verses like these from prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah and Daniel and Zechariah, and even verses from the law of Moses, because this picture is consistently found throughout the Old Testament. So when Paul says we proclaim His death until He comes, this is the moment that he's talking about. This is our great anticipation. The time when Jesus, the King of Glory, returns to fill the earth with His glory, to bring judgment down on His enemies, to reign in peace and righteousness forever with His people. Now, let's take a moment to appreciate why the Jews were so confused by Jesus. I mean, they're waiting for the King of Glory to come, and this guy shows up. Carpenter's son, raised in Nazareth, out of which nothing good comes. And he doesn't look like a king, and he doesn't seem to really have any interest in like overthrowing the Romans and being mighty in battle and elevating the Jews on Mount Zion and destroying all the Gentiles. And so naturally they think he's just blaspheming because he says, I'm God's son. I'm the King of glory. I'm the Messiah. And they say that's absurd. And they crucify him, which only then confirms that he could not have been the King of glory in their minds, because the law of Moses says that anybody who is hanged on a tree, well, that means that you're actually accursed by God himself. So there's no way you could have been God's chosen one because you were crucified. See, what they didn't understand is that Jesus coming with power and glory to judge his enemies had to start by judging Satan, bringing down judgment on the spiritual forces of wickedness. And the only way to do that was to destroy their power to keep us in sin by bearing the curse of sin in his body on the cross. In fact, this is why in John 12 and in John 17, Jesus speaks of his death on the cross as the way that he will be glorified by God. That's how he's going to enter glory. And in fact, when he rose from the grave, Paul said it was at that moment of his resurrection that Psalm 2 was fulfilled. He said in Acts 13:33, God has fulfilled this promise to our children, and that he raised up Jesus, as it is also written in the second Psalm, you are my son, today I have begotten you. The day Jesus rose from the grave, Paul's saying, was the day that God officially pronounced him King of glory. You are now officially my son in the kingship sense. You see, he came in glory and power the first time to defeat Satan on the cross. And now he reigns at the right hand of God in heaven until the final day of judgment, when he comes again in power and glory, this time to defeat death and to judge all the wicked who refuse to bow their knee to him, to save the righteous for all eternity, and to fulfill all those glorious, beautiful Old Testament passages in their fullest sense. Jesus said in Matthew 25:31, when the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, then he will sit on his glorious throne. And you know, the best part of all is that when he comes back in glory, we Christians will get to share in his glory with him. We'll get to share his glorious, not just share his glory, we'll get to share his royal glory. We'll get to share his reigning glory. And I want to read one more passage with you this morning, if you'll turn to Revelation 2, because Jesus is speaking to the Christians in Thyatira undergoing persecution. And I want you to listen to his absolutely stunning promise to these Christians. In Revelation 2, verse 26 down through 28. And again, this is Jesus speaking. It says, he who overcomes and he who keeps my deeds until the end, to him I will give authority over the nations, and he shall rule them with a rod of iron, as the vessels of the potter are broken to pieces. As I also have received authority from my Father, and I will give him the morning star. What I want you to see is that Jesus quotes Psalm 2, which was written about him. And what he says is, if we overcome and stay faithful, we too will join him in his glorious reign in the defeat of all of our enemies. You see, when the nations plot against Christians and persecute Christians, they are also plotting and devising a vain thing, because God also will be elevating us in the end to a position of glorious rulership for all eternity. And I will wait until Bible class to talk about the morning star. But you know, as we partake of the Lord's Supper this morning, let's do so with a longing and an eager anticipation for the coming of the King of glory. And what a blessing that his coming does not have to be a terrifying thing for us as Christians, because The fact that we're taking this supper is a sign that we are actually taking refuge in Jesus instead of rebelling against him and plotting against him like the nations. Let's take comfort in knowing when the King of Glory comes, all of the evil in this world that plagues us so much will be completely removed and judged and dealt with. And let's take comfort that our King of Glory was willing to be crucified so that we could have pure hearts, purified hands, so that we could be ready for the coming of our King and ready to share in his glory.